The wagon stopped outside Red River Ranch, under a sky white with heat, dust settling around its wheels like judgment. Reverend Silas Pritchard stepped down from the driver's bench, his black coat spotless despite the Texas roads, his face carved from righteousness and stone. Behind him sat his daughter Margaret, hands folded in her lap, her spine straight as the pews her father preached from every Sunday. What happened next would echo across 3 counties, and Margaret Pritchard would never see her father's face again. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The ranch yard sprawled wide and busy under the noon sun, a place built from sweat and cattle and the kind of stubborn determination that carved civilization from wilderness. Corrals are stretched in every direction, horses shifting restlessly in the heat, their tails swishing at flies. Cowboys moved between the buildings, some mending tack, others working a green horse in the round pen, their voices carrying across the open space in low drawls. The main house stood 2 stories tall, its timber frame solid and weathered, flanked by a bunkhouse, a cook shack, and barns that smelled of hay and leather and manure. Cole Hayes stood near the hitching post, discussing the upcoming cattle drive with his foreman. He was a man in his late 30s, broad through the shoulders, his face tanned dark from years under the Texas sun. He owned Red River Ranch outright, 5,000 acres of good grazing land stretching to the horizon, and he ran it with the kind of quiet authority that made men follow without question. When he spoke, ranch hands listened. When he gave his word, it held like iron. The preacher's wagon rolled into the yard unannounced, its wheels crunching over hard-packed earth. Work slowed as men turned to watch. Visitors were common enough, but something about the wagon's approach, the rigid set of the driver's shoulders, carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. Silas Pritchard climbed down from his bench with the deliberate movements of a man performing a ritual. His boots hit the ground with authority. His hat sat perfectly level on his head, casting shadow across eyes that held no warmth. He was a traveling preacher, known across 3 counties for his thundering sermons about sin and damnation, about the weakness of flesh and the punishment that awaited the unrighteous. His circuit took him from town to town, setting up his tent wherever souls needed saving, his voice rising and falling like the wrath of God himself. He had built his reputation on purity, on being above reproach, on standing as an example of what godliness looked like in a land that seemed determined to slide into wickedness. People listened when he preached because he seemed untouchable by the corruption around him, a pillar of righteousness in a world drowning in sin. Behind him in the wagon, Margaret sat motionless. She was 19 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, her dress high-necked and plain, the color of ash. Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced, knuckles white from pressure. She did not look at the ranch hands who were beginning to gather. She did not look at her father. She stared straight ahead at nothing, her jaw set tight, her breathing shallow and controlled. Cole Hayes walked forward, his foreman trailing a few steps behind. Other ranch hands drifted closer, drawn by curiosity and the sense that something significant was about to unfold. A dozen men formed a loose semicircle around the wagon, their work abandoned, their attention fixed on the preacher and the girl who sat rigid as carved wood behind him. Silas Pritchard waited until the crowd had gathered. He wanted witnesses. That much was clear in the way he surveyed the men, his gaze sweeping across their faces with the same measuring look he used before beginning a sermon. When he spoke, his voice carried across the yard with practiced projection, the voice of a man accustomed to being heard over wind and distance. "Cole Hayes," he said, addressing the rancher directly, "you sent word last month that you needed workers for your drive north. Good hands who could be trusted with your cattle and your reputation." Cole nodded slowly, his expression cautious. "I did. We're heading to Kansas in 3 weeks. Always looking for capable hands." I have come to settle a debt, Silas continued, his voice rising slightly, ensuring every man present could hear clearly, and to rid myself of a burden that has brought shame upon my ministry and disgrace upon the name I carry. A murmur rippled through the gathered cowboys. Cole's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing, waiting. Silas turned and gestured toward the wagon, toward Margaret, his arm extending like an accusation. My daughter, Margaret Pritchard. I raised her in the fear of the Lord, taught her scripture from the time she could speak, kept her apart from the wickedness of this world. And yet she has chosen sin. Chosen deliberately, with full knowledge of the consequences. Margaret's fingers tightened in her lap, but her face remained still. She had known this was coming. Had known from the moment her father ordered her into the wagon 3 days ago that he would not simply leave her somewhere quietly. He needed to make a spectacle of it. Needed to prove her to the world that his righteousness was intact, that he would not compromise even for his own blood. She was discovered, Silas said, his voice dropping into the tone he used for his most damning pronouncements, teaching a woman of sin to read. Not just any woman, but a saloon girl, a woman who had sold her virtue for money, who lived in open defiance of God's law. And my daughter, knowing full well what this woman represented, chose to spend her time in secret meetings, teaching her letters, encouraging her in the delusion that reading scripture might redeem her filthy soul. He paused, letting the words settle over the crowd like dust. Several cowboys shifted uncomfortably. Others frowned, confusion crossing their faces. Cole Hayes remained perfectly still, his attention fixed on the preacher, then flickering briefly to Margaret. I warned her, Silas continued, his voice building now into the rhythm of condemnation. I told her that association with sin is sin itself, that to extend fellowship to the unrighteous is to become unrighteous, that a pure vessel cannot carry filth without becoming filthy itself. But she defied me. She argued with me, in my own home, using my own scripture against me, claiming that Christ himself ate with tax collectors and sinners. His jaw tightened, anger flashing across his face before he controlled it. She dared to suggest that my teaching was wrong, that my understanding of God's word was incomplete. She accused me of pride. Me, who has spent 20 years preaching the gospel, who has brought hundreds to repentance. She, a girl of 19 with no education beyond what I provided, presumed to correct me. The silence in the yard was absolute now. Even the horses seemed to sense the weight of the moment, standing quiet in their corrals. I cast her out, Silas declared, his voice ringing with finality. I will not have rebellion under my roof. I will not have my ministry tainted by association with one who chooses sin over obedience. I will not allow my reputation, built over decades of faithful service, to be destroyed by a daughter who refuses to submit to godly authority. He turned fully toward Cole Hayes now, his expression hard as flint. You need workers. I need to be free of this burden. Take her. She is strong enough for labor, healthy enough to earn her keep. Consider it payment for any services I may have rendered to your men during my circuit preaching. Consider the settlement of any obligation between us. But know this, I do not give her to you as a daughter. I cast her off as judgment. What you do with her is your concern, not mine. Cole's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes had gone cold. You're giving me your daughter. As payment. I am ridding myself of disobedience and shame. Silas corrected sharply. Call it what you will. She is no longer my concern. I have warned her of the consequences. I have given her every opportunity to repent, to submit, to return to the path of righteousness. She has refused. Therefore, she is dead to me. Let her learn through hardship what she refused to learn through instruction. Margaret's breath came faster now, though she fought to control it. Her nails dug into her palms. She had expected this, had prepared herself for it during the long, silent journey to the ranch. But hearing her father speak the words aloud, hearing him declare her dead to him in front of strangers, cut deeper than she had anticipated. She thought of the woman she had been teaching. Rose, her name was, a girl only a year older than Margaret herself, who had ended up in a saloon because she had nowhere else to go, no family to take her in, no skills to earn honest wages. Margaret had met her by accident, had seen the hunger in her eyes when she looked at the Bible Margaret carried. "I wish I could read it," Rose whispered. "I wish I knew what it said about people like me." So Margaret had taught her. In secret, in the back room of the general store, where the owner's wife had agreed to let them meet. Every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon for 3 months, Margaret had taught Rose letters and words, had watched her trace passages with trembling fingers, had seen tears fall onto pages as Rose read. For the first time, about grace and mercy and the possibility of redemption. Her father had found out through gossip, through some well-meaning church member who thought the reverend should know what his daughter was doing. He had confronted her in a rage, demanded she stop immediately, called her naive and foolish and dangerously corrupted by proximity to sin. Margaret had tried to explain, had tried to tell him that this was exactly what Christ had done, exactly what the Gospels commanded, but her father would not hear it. To him, sin was contagious, and his daughter had exposed herself to contamination. The argument had escalated. Margaret had quoted scripture back at him, had challenged his interpretation, had asked how they could claim to believe in redemption while refusing to extend it to those who needed it most. Her father had struck her then, the only time in her life he had raised his hand to her. The slap had been sharp and sudden, snapping her head sideways, bringing tears to her eyes. "You dare correct me," he said. "You dare use God's word as a weapon against your own father." That had been 4 days ago. He had barely spoken to her since, had simply ordered her to pack what she could carry, to prepare for a journey. She had known better than to ask where they were going. The answer was clear enough in his eyes. Now, standing in this ranch yard under the merciless sun, Margaret understood fully what her defiance had cost her. Her father was not simply sending her away, he was erasing her, declaring her dead, removing her from his life and his ministry as if she had never existed. The public nature of it was deliberate. He needed witnesses to his righteousness. Needed people to see that he would not compromise, not even for his own daughter. Cole Hayes stepped closer to the wagon. His eyes moved from Silas to Margaret, studying her face. She met his gaze for the first time, forcing herself not to look away. She saw no cruelty there, but no pity either. Only a kind of measuring assessment, as if he were evaluating livestock. "Get down," Cole said quietly. It was not unkind, but it was not optional. Margaret stood on unsteady legs. She climbed down from the wagon, her dress catching briefly on the rough wood before, pulling free. When her boots hit the ground, her knees nearly buckled, but she locked them straight, refusing to show weakness in front of these men. Silas Pritchard climbed back onto his bench without another word to his daughter. He did not look at her, did not offer any final instruction or warning or even acknowledgement. He simply gathered the reins, clicked his tongue to the horses, and began to turn the wagon around. "Reverend," Cole called out, his voice sharp enough to halt the preacher's movements. Silas looked back, his expression impatient. "A man who casts off his own blood for trying to show mercy," Cole said slowly, each word deliberate, "might want to reconsider which one of them is closer to sin." The preacher's face flushed dark. His mouth opened as if to deliver a rebuke. But something in Cole Hayes' stance, in the set of his shoulders and the cold steadiness of his gaze, made him think better of it. Instead, he snapped the reins hard, and the wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding over packed earth. Margaret watched him go. Watched the wagon grow smaller as it moved toward the road, dust rising in its wake like smoke. She watched until it disappeared completely beyond the first rise, until even the sound of wheels and hooves faded into the vast silence of the Texas prairie. When she finally turned back toward the ranch yard, every eye was on her. Cowboys stared with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity to discomfort. None of them seemed to know what to say. The foreman shifted his weight, cleared his throat, looked away. Cole Hayes stood a few feet from her, arms crossed over his chest. "You know anything about cattle?" Margaret's voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. "No, sir." "Can you ride?" "Side saddle." "A little." "Can you cook?" "Some." "Can you mend?" "Yes, sir." Cole nodded slowly, as if tallying these answers against some internal calculation. "Your father just paid me in human currency. I don't hold with that. Never have, but you're here now, and sending you off alone would be worse than keeping you." He paused, his jaw working as he considered. "You'll work, same as anyone else here. You pull your weight, you eat, you earn your keep, you have a place. But I won't have anyone on this ranch who doesn't carry their share. Understood?" Preparing and narrating, this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Understood. You'll bunk with Maria, the cook's wife. She'll show you what needs doing. We drive cattle in 3 weeks. Between now and then, you'll learn what you can. After that, we'll see if you've got what it takes to make the drive north. Margaret nodded. Her throat was too tight for words. Cole turned to his foreman. "Get her settled, and tell the men anyone who has a problem with how she got here can take it up with me directly." The foreman nodded, though uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "Yes, sir, Mr. Hayes." Cole looked back at Margaret one more time. "What you did teaching that woman to read your father's a fool for calling it sin, but you'll find life's harder out here than in church pews. Keep your head down, work hard, and don't expect special treatment because of what happened today." "Fair enough, fair enough," Margaret whispered. He nodded once more, then turned and walked toward the main house, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The gathered cowboys began to disperse, returning to their work with reluctant glances back at the new arrival. Conversations would follow later, Margaret knew. Stories would be told in the bunkhouse tonight about the preacher who gave away his daughter like she was currency. But for now she stood alone in the center of the yard, the sun hammering down on her shoulders, her father's wagon long gone, her old life finished. The scar of his rejection burned like a brand, invisible but permanent. She did not cry, would not give him that. Instead, she straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and when the foreman gestured for her to follow, she walked forward into the unknown with the same dignity she had maintained on the wagon. What her father meant as punishment, she would transform into survival. What he intended as the end of her story was only the beginning, and though she could not know it yet, the skills she would learn on this ranch, the person she would become in dust and cattle and endless Texas sky, would make her name legendary, long after her father's preaching was forgotten. But first, she had to survive the afternoon. Maria Castellano stood barely 5 feet tall, her frame sturdy as mesquite wood, her hair threaded with silver and pulled back in a thick braid. She smelled of wood smoke and cornmeal, her hands perpetually dusted with flour or stained from handling meat. She looked Margaret up and down with the practiced eye of someone who had seen plenty of lost souls drift through ranch life, most of them not lasting more than a week. "That dress won't last a day out here," she said, her accent carrying the soft edges of Spanish beneath English words. "Come." The room Maria led her to was barely larger than a storage closet attached to the back of the cook shack. A narrow cot, a wooden crate for belongings, a wash basin on a rickety stand. One small window looked out toward the eastern pastures. The walls were bare timber, gaps between some boards wide enough to see daylight through. Maria pulled a bundle from a shelf and dropped it onto the cot. These belong to a ranch hand who left last year. They'll be big, but better than what you're wearing. 2 pairs of canvas trousers, 3 work shirts, a leather vest worn soft with age. Change. Then come to the cook shack. We start preparing supper at 4, but there's work before that. Margaret waited until Maria left, then stripped out of her dress with trembling fingers. The trousers felt strange against her legs, the fabric rough and foreign. She had never worn men's clothing in her life. Her father would have called it an abomination, a corruption of God's natural order. She buttoned the shirt with fumbling hands, rolled the sleeves up past her wrists. When she caught her reflection in the small mirror above the wash basin, she barely recognized herself. The cook shack was a long building with a massive iron stove at one end, work tables down the center, and shelves lined with sacks of flour, beans, cornmeal, dried beef. The heat inside, pressed down like a physical weight. The stove radiating waves that made sweat break across Margaret's forehead within seconds. Maria handed her a bucket. "Well's behind the bunkhouse. Fill this. We'll need 20 buckets before we start cooking." The well sat in full sun, no shade anywhere near it. Margaret lowered the bucket on its rope, heard the distant splash, hauled it back up with arms that began burning by the 3rd pull. Water sloshed over the sides as she carried it back toward the cook shack, soaking into her trouser legs, making her boots slip. By the 5th trip, her shoulders screamed. By the 10th, blisters rose hot and raw across her palms. She had never done labor like this. Her life had been scripture study and needlework, accompanying her father on his circuit, sitting quietly in churches while he preached. The heaviest thing she had lifted regularly was a cast iron skillet. Now, her entire body protested each movement, muscles she did not know she possessed announcing themselves through pain. Maria worked without pause, directing Margaret through tasks with terse instructions. "Peel potatoes, chop onions, steer the beans while I handle the beef, keep that fire fed, don't let the cornbread burn." The commands came fast and continuous, leaving no time for rest or hesitation. The knife felt awkward in Margaret's blistered hand. The potatoes came out uneven, chunks too large, mixed with pieces too small. Maria glanced at her work, said nothing, simply scooped the pieces into the pot where they would boil regardless of their shape. By the time the dinner bell rang, Margaret's vision swam with exhaustion. Cowboys flooded into the dining hall attached to the cook shack, 23. Men who had worked since dawn and now descended on the food like locusts. They ate with single-minded efficiency, barely looking up from their plates, conversation minimal. Margaret stood against the wall, uncertain where she fit in this ritual. Maria pressed a plate into her hands. "Eat. You'll need strength for tomorrow." The food tasted like sawdust in her mouth, though it was probably fine. Exhaustion had stolen her appetite, but she forced herself to chew and swallow, knowing Maria spoke the truth. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not. Cole Hayes sat at the head of the long table, eating steadily, his attention on his foreman, who spoke in low tones about the herd count and which pastures to rotate. He did not look at Margaret, did not acknowledge her presence. But when one of the younger cowboys made to stand and approach her, Cole's hand came down flat on the table, a sharp sound that stopped all conversation. The cowboy sat back down. Nothing was said, nothing needed to be. After the men cleared out, the real work began. Plates and utensils piled high in wash basins, pots crusted with burnt food. The massive stove to be scraped clean. Margaret's hands plunged into water hot enough to redden her skin, lye soap biting into the fresh blisters. She scrubbed until her arms shook, until Maria finally took the rag from her hands. "Enough. Go sleep. We start again at 4 in the morning." Margaret stumbled to a tiny room as full darkness settled over the ranch. She collapsed onto the cot without removing her boots, too tired to care about propriety or comfort. Sleep took her like a hammer blow. She woke to Maria's hand shaking her shoulder, lamplight cutting through pre-dawn darkness. Her body had stiffened during the night, every muscle locked and protesting. Standing upright took genuine effort, her legs trembling as she pulled herself vertical. The work began again before the sun cleared the horizon. More water, more wood for the stove. Coffee strong enough to strip paint, biscuits mixed and baked, while bacon sizzled in wide cast-iron pans. The cowboys ate breakfast in the same efficient silence as dinner, then scattered to their various tasks across the ranch. "Today you learn stock," Maria said, leading Margaret outside into morning light that already carried heat. "Inventory, counting, tracking supplies. Mr. Hayes keeps careful records of everything that moves through this ranch." The supply barn held sacks of grain, coils of rope, spare tack, tools, barrels of salted beef, and flour and beans. Maria showed her the ledger, columns of numbers in neat handwriting, tracking every item received and distributed. "Mr. Hayes checks this every week. Shortages or mistakes, he notices." Margaret stared at the ledger, her head pounding. Numbers swam before her eyes. Her father had taught her to read and write, had drilled scripture into her memory, but practical arithmetic beyond basic household accounts was foreign territory. "Count the flour sacks," Maria instructed. "Mark the number, then beans, then everything else in this barn." The work was tedious and hot, dust coating her throat as she moved between stacks of supplies. She lost count twice and had to start over, frustration building behind her eyes. By noon her head throbbed and her hands cramped from gripping the pencil. Cole Hayes appeared in the barn doorway, his silhouette blocking the harsh sunlight. Margaret straightened, pencil poised above paper, suddenly aware of her disheveled appearance, the dust coating her clothes and hair. He walked through the barn slowly, his eyes moving over the stacks, the organization, the ledger in her hands. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could smell leather. "And horse and sweat. How many sacks of flour?" His voice was neutral, giving nothing away. 47, sir." He nodded once. "And beans?" 62. Another nod. He took the ledger from her hands, scanned the columns she had been filling. His finger traced down the page, checking her counts against the physical inventory visible around them. When he handed it back, something had shifted in his expression, though she could not name what. "Your numbers are accurate," he said. "That's more than most hands manage in their first week." He paused, then added, "You look dead on your feet. When you finish here, rest an hour before helping Maria with supper." "That's not a suggestion." He left before she could respond, his boots striking the ground in steady rhythm as he walked back toward the corrals. Margaret stood motionless, the ledger heavy in her hands. It was the first time since arriving that anyone had acknowledged her exhaustion, the difficulty of what she was attempting. Not with sympathy exactly, but with simple recognition of fact. And the order to rest, delivered as command, rather than kindness, somehow carried more weight because of it. She finished the inventory with renewed focus, her counts careful and precise. When she finally walked out of the barn into the afternoon sun, the light felt different somehow, less punishing. The hour of rest was the first moment of stillness since the wagon had left her standing in the yard. Margaret sat on the edge of her cot, her body slowly unknotting, her mind drifting. She thought about her father, wondered if he had reached his next town yet, whether he had already begun preaching, whether he mentioned having a daughter at all, or had simply erased her from his narrative. She thought about Rose, the saloon girl she had taught to read. Wondered if Rose still had the Bible Margaret had left with her, if she continued practicing her letters alone, if she thought about Margaret at all, or had simply moved on. One more brief connection in a life full of impermanence. Then she thought about the ledger, about Cole Hayes saying her numbers were accurate, about the command to rest that felt strangely like respect. It was not much to hold on to, but it was something, proof that she could learn, could contribute, could be more than the shameful burden her father had named her. When she returned to the cook shack, Maria handed her a jar of salve. For the blisters, they'll only get worse if you ignore them. Margaret took the jar, her throat tight. Thank you, Maria shrugged. Can't have you bleeding into the food. Bad for business. But there was something in the older woman's eyes, a flicker of understanding that went beyond practical concerns. Maria had seen Margaret's struggle, her determination to keep working despite obvious pain, her refusal to complain or ask for accommodation. And, in some silent language, Margaret was only beginning to understand that had registered as worthy of notice. Supper. Preparations went smoother than the night before. Margaret's hands knew where things were now, her movements slightly less clumsy. The blisters still burned, but the salve helped, and she had learned to hold the knife differently, to distribute the pressure across her palm rather than concentrating it in one spot. When the cowboys came in for supper, she no longer pressed herself against the wall. She moved through the room collecting empty plates, refilling coffee cups, her presence becoming part of the routine rather than an intrusion. Cole Hayes caught her eye once across the crowded dining hall. He gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, before returning to his conversation with the foreman. But Margaret felt it like a hand on her shoulder, steadying her, acknowledging that she was still standing after 2 days of labor that would have broken someone softer. That night, she removed her boots before collapsing into bed. Small victory, but she counted it nonetheless. Her body still ached everywhere, exhaustion still dragged at her like heavy water. But she had survived 2 full days, had proven she could work, could learn, could carry her weight. Outside her window, the Texas sky spread vast and dark, stars scattered like salt across black cloth. Somewhere out there, her father slept under the same stars, convinced he had delivered righteous judgment. He believed he had cast her out into hardship that would break her, teach her the cost of defiancy, purvey the superiority of his authority. He had no idea what he had actually done, had no concept that the hardship he intended as punishment might forge her into something stronger than she had been in his carefully controlled world. Margaret's eyes closed. Tomorrow would bring more water to haul, more inventory to count, more tasks she did not yet know how to do. But tomorrow would also bring another chance to prove she belonged here. Another day of choosing this life over the one her father had demanded she accept. The ranch settled into night sounds around her, horses shifting in corrals, a dog barking somewhere distant, the low murmur of cowboys in the bunkhouse, and beneath it all, the vast silence of open land, stretching in every direction, indifferent to human drama, patient as stone. Margaret slept. The third morning brought a change. Maria woke Margaret in darkness as usual, but this time handed her a different set of instructions. Mr. Hayes wants you in the corrals after breakfast. Says you need to learn horses before the drive. Margaret's stomach tightened. The cook shack was one thing enclosed, predictable, with clear tasks and Maria's steady presence. The corrals meant working alongside the cowboys, being visible, being judged with every move she made. She served breakfast with hands that wanted to shake, poured coffee with exaggerated care, avoided meeting any of the men's eyes. When they filed out, she lingered over the cleanup until Maria physically turned her toward the door. Go. Keeping Mr. Hayes waiting is worse than whatever you're afraid of. The main corral spread wide behind the barn, split rails weathered gray, churned dirt packed hard from countless hooves. A dozen horses milled inside, some calm, others skittish, their coats gleaming in early light. Cowboys leaned against the fence, talking in low voices, watching a young gelding dance nervously at the far end. Cole Hayes stood near the gate, examining a saddle draped over the top rail. He looked up when Margaret approached, his expression unreadable. You said you could ride side saddle. That's useless here. Time to learn proper. He gestured toward a Thunmare standing hip-shot near the water trough, her eyes half closed in the morning warmth. That's Bess. She's 15 years old and has more patience than most people. If you're going to learn, she's who'll teach you. A tall cowboy with sun-bleached hair separated from the group, leading Bess forward by a rope halter. He was young, maybe 25, his face open and friendly in a way that somehow made Margaret more nervous rather than less. "This is Travis Keller," Cole said. "He'll show you the basics. Travis, she's never straddled a horse in her life, so assume she knows nothing." Travis grinned. "Yes, sir." He looked at Margaret, his expression shifting to something more serious. "Don't worry. Bess here is the best teacher on the ranch. She's trained more hands than I have." Cole walked away toward the barn, leaving Margaret alone with Travis and the mare. Other cowboys returned to their work, though she felt their attention still lingering, watching from the corners of their vision. Travis showed her the saddle first, explaining each piece: cinch, stirrups, horn, cantle, his hands moving over the leather with practiced familiarity. "Most important thing is the cinch. Too loose, saddle rolls and you're on the ground. Too tight, horse can't breathe proper. You want it snug but not strangling." He demonstrated on Bess, his movements efficient and sure. The mare stood still as stone, completely unbothered by the process. When the saddle was secure, Travis turned to Margaret. "Now you try. Take it all off and put it back on." Her hands fumbled with the buckles, fingers clumsy with nervousness and the lingering soreness from 2 days of labor. The saddle was heavier than she expected, awkward to lift. She managed to get it onto Bess's back, but positioned too far forward. Travis didn't correct her with words, just silently removed it and waited while she tried again. Third attempt, she got it right. The cinch took 6 tries before Travis nodded approval. By then, sweat dampened her collar despite the cool morning air. "Good. Now mounting. Left foot in stirrup, grab the horn, swing your right leg over. Don't kick her in the process." Margaret stared at the stirrup, which suddenly seemed impossibly high. She fitted her boot into it, gripped the horn with both hands, and tried to pull herself up. Her arms, still exhausted from holding water, couldn't generate enough force. She hopped twice on her right foot, trying to gain momentum, and succeeded only in making Bess shift sideways with what seemed like equine annoyance. "Use your leg," Travis instructed. "Push up from the stirrup, don't just pull with your arms." She tried again. This time managed to get high enough that her stomach hit the saddle before she lost momentum and slid back down, her boots hitting dirt hard enough to jar her teeth. From somewhere near the barn, she heard low laughter. Not cruel exactly, but not kind either. Her face burned. She wanted to walk away, to retreat to the cook shack where at least she was beginning to understand the work. Travis stepped closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "First time I mounted a horse, I got so scared halfway up, I froze, hung there like a sack of grain until my father had to push me the rest of the way over. Looked like a complete fool." He smiled slightly. "You're doing better than I did. Try again." Margaret gripped the horn, positioned her foot, pushed hard from the stirrup. This time her leg swung over, and suddenly she was sitting in the saddle, higher than she had ever been on side saddle. Her legs spread in a way that felt completely foreign and slightly scandalous. "There," Travis said with satisfaction. "Now you're riding." Bess stood perfectly still, as if aware she carried a beginner. Margaret's hands gripped the horn so tight, her knuckles went white. The ground seemed very far away. "Reins," Travis said, handing them up to her. "Hold them loose. Bess doesn't need much guidance, but you need to learn the feel. Gentle pressure for turning, pull back for stop. Squeeze with your legs for walk. Don't kick unless you want to run, and trust me, you don't want to run yet." He led Bess forward in a slow circle around the corral, keeping one hand on the halter, talking Margaret through every step. "Feel how she moves? That's her rhythm. You want to move with it, not against it. Relax your hips. Let yourself follow the motion. Margaret tried to relax. Her entire body was rigid, every muscle locked against the unfamiliar sensation of movement beneath her. But gradually, as Bess plodded calmly around the corral, something began to shift. The mare's gait was steady and predictable, her movements gentle. Margaret's death grip on the horn eased slightly. "Good," Travis encouraged. "Now try guiding her yourself. I'll let go." Panic spiked through her. "I don't. You do. Just light pressure on the left rein. She'll turn." Travis released the halter and stepped back. Margaret sat alone on the horse, responsible for where they went. She squeezed the left rein, as instructed. Bess turned her head, followed through with her body, and they moved in a new direction. Margaret squeezed her legs. Bess walked forward, pulled back on the reins. Bess stopped. It was the smallest possible accomplishment. A child could do it, but sitting there, in the morning sun, controlling 1,000 pounds of animal through signals, she was only just learning. Margaret felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, not quite confidence, but the seed of it. She rode for an hour under Travis's instruction, circles and figure eights, stopping and starting, learning to sit the walk without bouncing. By the time Travis called it done, her legs trembled from gripping the saddle and her lower back ached from the unfamiliar posture. Dismounting proved harder than mounting. She swung her leg over and dropped too fast, her knees buckling when she hit the ground. Travis caught her elbow, steadying her until her legs remembered how to lock. "Tomorrow we'll work on trotting," you said. "You did good for the first time." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. She unsaddled Bess with Travis watching, her hands remembering the steps better than she expected. When the mare was brushed and turned back into the corral, Travis handed Margaret a canteen. "Drink, then get some food, before afternoon work starts." The water was cool and clean. Margaret drank deeply, feeling the ache in her muscles settle into something almost pleasant. Travis walked beside her toward the cook shack, his stride easy and unhurried. "Your father," he said after a moment, surprising her with the directness. "The preacher. I heard him speak once, about 2 years back. He came through my hometown during a revival." Margaret tensed, waiting for judgment or questions she couldn't answer. "He talked about hell for 2 hours," Travis continued, his voice neutral. "Fire and damnation, and all the ways people deserved punishment. I left feeling like God hated everyone and we were all doomed no matter what we did." He glanced at her. "That woman you taught to read, the one he was angry about. I figure she probably needed someone to show her kindness more than she needed another person telling her she was damned. You did it right." The words hit Margaret harder than she expected. Her throat went tight. "Thank you," Travis shrugged. "Just saying what's true. Anyway, you're doing fine here. Keep at it." He split off toward the bunkhouse, leaving Margaret standing outside the cook shack with something warm and fragile taking root beneath her ribs. Someone had noticed, had understood, had looked at what her father called sin and named it rightness instead. The afternoon brought new challenges. Coal haze appeared while Margaret helped Maria prepare vegetables, his hat in his hands, dust streaking his shirt. "Need you to help inventory the tack room." Marcus threw his back out and can't bend proper. The tack room smelled of leather and oil, saddles lined on racks, bridles hanging from pegs, bits and spurs, and assorted hardware filling shelves and boxes. Marcus Donnelly sat on a stool near the door, his face grey with pain, a ledger balanced on his lap. He was older than most of the hands, somewhere north of 50, with silver threading his dark hair and lines, carved deep, around his eyes. When Margaret entered, he looked up with an expression caught between relief and uncertainty. "Mr. Hayes says you're good with counting," he said, his voice tight. "Need to verify everything in here matches the records before the drive. Usually I'd do it myself, but He gestured at his back, frustration clear in the movement. Margaret took the ledger from him. "Tell me what needs checking." For 2 hours they worked through the inventory together, Marcus calling out items from his position by the door, Margaret counting and recording. His initial wariness faded as she proved competent, her numbers accurate, her questions intelligent when she didn't understand something. "Spade bits. How many?" Marcus asked. Margaret counted carefully, moving along the shelf. 17. Should be 18. "Check again," she recounted. Then searched the floor, the workbench, finally spotting one that had fallen behind a bucket. 18. Marcus grunted approval. "Good eye. Mr. Hayes is particular about things being where they should be. A missing bit on the drive can mean the difference between controlling a horse and getting thrown." They fell into an easy rhythm, the work tedious but manageable. Marcus began volunteering information without being asked, explaining why certain equipment mattered, what would be needed for the drive north, how the ranch operated on a larger scale. "Red River's one of the biggest operations in this part of Texas," he said. "Mr. Hayes built it from nothing. Come here 15 years ago with 100 head of half-wild cattle and a dream. Now we run 5,000 head and employ 30 men year-round. He's fair but demanding. Expects everyone to pull their weight, but rewards those who do." Margaret recorded another line of numbers. "How long have you worked here?" "Since the beginning. I was one of his first hires." Marcus shifted on the stool, wincing. "Seen a lot of people come through. Most don't last. Ranch life's harder than folks expect. But those who stick, who prove themselves, Mr. Hayes takes care of them. Builds something like family, though he'd never say it that way." "Why did you stay?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Because I'd worked at other ranches before this one. Places where the owner squeezed every ounce of work from you and gave nothing back. Where being injured meant being fired. Mr. Hayes isn't like that. When my wife got sick 3 years back, he paid for the doctor himself, told me to take whatever time I needed. That kind of loyalty goes both ways." The words settled over Margaret like a weight and a promise simultaneously. She was beginning to understand the structure beneath the ranch's daily operations, the unspoken codes that governed how people treated each other here. Work hard, prove yourself, and you became part of something larger than yourself. Failed to carry your weight, and you'd be gone. By the time they finished, the sun had dropped toward the horizon, the tack room dim with long shadows. Marcus stood slowly, testing his back. "You did good work, accurate and fast. I'll tell Mr. Hayes, thank you." He paused at the door, looking back at her. "That business with your father, I don't know the details and won't ask. But I've seen enough of life to know that sometimes family does more harm than strangers. You landed in a decent place. Make the most of it." Margaret nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. Marcus limped away into the dusk, leaving her alone with shelves of leather and iron, and the growing realization that this place might actually allow her to belong. Supper that night felt subtly different. When Margaret moved through the dining hall refilling coffee, some of the cowboys nodded thanks. Travis called out across the room, "How's your backside after riding? Hurting yet?" Laughter rippled through the room, but it wasn't cruel. Just the easy teasing of people who had all experienced the same pain when learning. "Plenty?" Margaret admitted, and the laughter grew warmer. "Wait till tomorrow." Another hand called out, "Second day's always worse." "Don't listen to him," Travis shot back. "Third day's the killer." Cole Hayes watched this exchange from his seat at the head table, saying nothing, but something in his expression had softened almost imperceptibly. He caught Margaret's eye briefly, gave the smallest nod, then returned to his food. After cleanup, Maria pressed a small bundle into Margaret's hands. From some of the men, they took up a collection. Inside were 2 pair of riding gloves, worn but serviceable, the leather soft from use. Margaret stared at them, something hot and sharp building behind her eyes. "Don't make a scene," Maria said gruffly. "They just don't want you bleeding on the reins." Practical, not sentimental. But her eyes told a different story. The ranch was noticing Margaret's efforts, her determination to learn despite obvious difficulty. And in their own rough way, they were beginning to accept her. That night, Margaret lay in her narrow cot, her body aching in new places from riding, her hands sore despite the gloves she'd use tomorrow. Through the thin walls, she could hear the distant murmur of cowboys in the bunkhouse, someone playing a harmonica, the sound drifting through evening air. She thought about Travis's words, about Marcus's acceptance, about the gloves that represented more than just protection from blisters. Small gestures, but they added up to something significant. The ranch was not actively hostile, was not waiting for her to fail, was instead watching to see if she would succeed, willing to help when she proved she deserved it. Her father's voice still echoed sometimes in her head, pronouncing judgment, declaring her shameful and sinful and deserving of punishment. But those voices were growing quieter, drowned out by other sounds. Travis patiently explaining horse sense, Marcus sharing ranch history, Maria's gruff kindness, Cole Hayes's steady expectation that she would rise to meet challenges placed before her. Margaret touched the gloves, their leather smooth against her fingertips. Tomorrow she would ride again, would learn to trot, would probably fall and embarrass herself and get back up to try again, would haul more water and count more inventory and serve more meals, would continue proving with each small task that she belonged here, that what her father called sin was actually the capacity for growth. Outside her window, the Texas night spread vast and full of stars. Somewhere out there, her father preached his gospel of condemnation. But here, on Red River Ranch, a different kind of teaching was taking place. One built not on judgment, but on merit. Not on who you had been, but on who you proved yourself to be. Margaret closed her eyes. Her muscles would hurt worse tomorrow. The work would not get easier. But for the first time since the wagon had left her standing in the yard, she allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond simple survival. A future where this place became not just shelter, but home. The thought was fragile as spider silk, but it was there. And as sleep pulled her down, Margaret held on to it like a promise she was making to herself. She would not just survive here. She would become something her father could never have imagined, something he had accidentally made possible by casting her out. The ranch slept around her, and Margaret slept with it, one more person finding her place in the rhythm of this hard and honest life. The week before the drive, Cole Hayes changed Margaret's routine. She arrived at the corrals at dawn to find him waiting with 2 horses already saddled, his expression serious in the thin morning light. "You can walk and stop now," he said without preamble. "Time to learn what cattle work actually means. Mount up." Margaret climbed onto Bess with more confidence than a week ago, though her stomach churned with new anxiety. Riding in circles was one thing. Actually working cattle was something else entirely. They rode out past the main corrals toward the southern pasture, where 200 head grazed in the early coolness. The cattle were longhorns, lean and rangy, their massive horns spanning 6 feet or more. They looked prehistoric and vaguely dangerous, nothing like the placid dairy cows Margaret had seen in town. Cole pulled up at the pasture edge, his horse standing quiet beneath him. Cattle are simple but not easy. They're herd animals, so they want to stay together. Your job is to encourage them to do what they already want to do, just in the direction you need them to go. Fight against their nature and you'll lose every time. He pointed toward a cluster of cattle near the far fence. "See those 12 heads separated from the main group? We need them moved back with the others. Watch first." Cole nudged his horse forward into an easy lope, approaching the separated cattle at an angle. The cattle noticed him, heads lifting, bodies tensing. But Cole didn't rush, didn't push too hard. He positioned himself on one side, and the cattle naturally began drifting away from him, back toward the main herd. When one old cow tried to break the opposite direction, Cole moved his horse smoothly to block her path. The cow turned, rejoined her companions, and within 5 minutes all 12 head had merged back with the larger group. Cole rode back to where Margaret sat watching. "Your turn. See those 3 over by the water tank? Bring them back." Margaret's hands tightened on the reins. 3 seemed manageable. She urged Bess forward, trying to mirror what Cole had done. But she approached too directly, too fast. The cattle spooked, scattering in 3 different directions instead of grouping together. "Stop," Cole called. "You're hunting them, not herding them. Slow down. Give them space to think." She tried again. This time moved too slowly, too hesitantly. The cattle ignored her completely, continuing to graze as if Bess and Margaret were irrelevant. "More pressure," Cole instructed. "They need to know you mean business." Third attempt. Margaret managed to get 2 of the cattle moving in the right direction, but the third broke away and ran back toward the water tank. She wheeled Bess around to follow, but the mare didn't respond fast enough, and the cow escaped. Frustration burned hot in Margaret's chest. This looked easy when Cole did it. Why couldn't she manage 3 simple cows? "Again," Cole said, his voice betraying no impatience. "Every hand on this ranch failed at this exact thing when they started. The difference is whether you quit or keep trying." For an hour, Margaret chased those 3 cattle around the pasture, making every mistake possible. She pushed too hard, not hard enough, approached from the wrong angle, let them split apart, lost control completely when they decided to run. By the time she finally, through more luck than skill, managed to reunite all 3 with the main herd, sweat plastered her shirt to her back, and her arms ached from wrestling with Bess's reins. Cole nodded once. "Better. Now do it 5 more times with different cattle." Margaret wanted to argue, wanted to say she was exhausted and frustrated and clearly terrible at this. But something in Cole's steady gaze stopped her. He wasn't being cruel. He was teaching the way life taught, through repetition and failure and eventual improvement. She spent the morning moving small groups of cattle, each attempt slightly less disastrous than the last. By noon, her understanding had shifted from theoretical to visceral. She could feel when she was pushing too hard, when she wasn't applying enough pressure, when her positioning was wrong. The knowledge came not from Cole's words, but from the cattle themselves, their reactions teaching her what worked and what didn't. Cole finally called a halt, tossing her a canteen from his saddlebag. They sat their horses in the shade of a lone oak, the cattle grazing peacefully now that the harassment had ceased. "You're learning," Cole said. "Not fast, but honest. That matters more." Margaret drank deeply, her throat parched from dust and exertion. "I feel like I'm terrible at this." "You are," Cole agreed without hesitation. "But terrible is where everyone starts. The question is whether you'll still be terrible in 2 weeks. He pulled hardtack from his bag, handed her a piece. They ate in silence, the only sounds the cattle shifting and the wind moving through spring grass. "Why are you spending time teaching me?" Margaret asked finally. "You have experienced hands. I'm just—" She stopped, unsure how to finish. "Just what? A burden your father paid me with?" Cole's voice held an edge. "That's his story, not mine. In my story, you're a worker who needs training, same as any green hand I've ever hired. I spend time teaching you because I need capable people for this drive, and you might become capable if someone shows you how." He fixed her with a direct look. "Your father judged you for showing kindness to someone he thought was beneath notice. That tells me you have instincts worth developing. Now stop worrying about whether you deserve to be here and focus on getting better at the work." The words landed with the weight of a judgment rendered, but not the kind Margaret's father had specialized in. This was assessment based on potential rather than condemnation based on failure. They rode back to the ranch for a quick meal, then spent the afternoon in a different kind of education. Cole led her to the practice area where ranch hands learned to rope, a corral with wooden steer heads mounted on posts. "Can you throw a lasso?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "No, sir." He handed her a coiled rope. "Then learn. This is how we catch cattle that won't be herded, how we pull them from mud or brush, how we doctor them when they're sick. A hand who can't rope is only half useful." Roping proved even harder than herding. The rope felt alien in Margaret's hands, the weight distribution wrong, the movements completely counterintuitive. She watched Cole demonstrate, his loop sailing out in a perfect circle, settling cleanly over the wooden steer head. When she tried, her loop collapsed halfway through the throw, landing in a tangled mess at her feet. Again, she tried, failed, tried again. The rope kinked, twisted, refused to cooperate. Her shoulder began burning from the repetitive motion. Other cowboys drifted past, some pausing to watch. A few offered advice, which only confused her more. Each person seemed to have their own technique, their own way of explaining what was ultimately a skill learned through muscle memory rather than instruction. By the 20th attempt, Margaret's frustration had hardened into something darker. She whipped the rope forward with more anger than technique, and it actually looped properly, sailing toward the wooden head. Then at the last second, it twisted wrong and missed completely, settling around the post below instead of the target. "Better," Cole said. "That was almost right. It missed. By 2 feet instead of 10. That's progress." Margaret coiled the rope with jerky movements, her jaw tight. She had never been naturally bad at things before. Her life had been narrow, but she had excelled within its boundaries. Scripture memory, needlework, reading, basic arithmetic, all came easily. This physical world of horses and cattle and ropes that didn't obey, logic was exposing every limitation she had never known she possessed. "I'm not going to be good at this," she said, the words coming out harder than intended. Cole took the rope from her hands. "Not today, no. Maybe not next week. But I've seen green hands become good ropers through practice. I've also seen naturally talented people quit because they weren't immediately perfect." He handed the rope back. "Which one are you?" The challenge in his voice stung. Margaret grabbed the rope, positioned herself, and threw. This time the loop held its shape longer, made it 3/4 of the way before collapsing. Progress, barely, but real. "Again," Cole said. She threw until her arm felt like it would fall off, until the movements became automatic, even if they weren't yet successful. When Cole finally called it done, she had managed to cleanly rope the wooden steer exactly once. One success out of perhaps 50 attempts. "That's enough for today," Cole said. "Tomorrow morning, cattle work again. Afternoon, more roping, every day until the drive." Margaret nodded mutely, too exhausted to speak. Cole walked away toward the barn, leaving her standing in the practice corral with the rope still in her hands and the wooden steer head mocking her with its frozen expression. Travis appeared at the fence, his friendly face sympathetic. "First week of roping is always brutal. My hands bled so bad I couldn't hold a fork at dinner. How long until you were good at it?" "Good? Maybe 6 months. Good enough not to embarrass myself. About a month." He grinned. "You'll get there. Cole wouldn't waste time on you if he thought you couldn't learn." The words helped marginally. Margaret hung the rope on its peg and walked toward the cook shack, her entire body protesting. Maria took one look at her and pointed to the wash basin. "Clean up, then peel potatoes. Nothing requiring concentration." The repetitive work of peeling was almost meditative after the frustration of roping. Margaret's hands moved automatically, her mind drifting. She thought about Cole's question. Which was she, someone who quit when things got hard, or someone who pushed through? Her father would say she was defiant, stubborn, unwilling to accept proper authority. But maybe stubbornness was just another word for persistence. Maybe defiance, when pointed in the right direction, became determination. A week before the drive, Cole changed tactics. Instead of drilling Margaret endlessly on his skills she was still terrible at, he began teaching her the supporting work that kept a cattle drive functioning. Drives need more than ropers and riders, he explained, leading her to the chuck wagon being loaded for the journey. Need people who understand supplies, organization, what's required to keep men and animals fed across 400 miles. The chuck wagon was a marvel of efficient storage, every space utilized, everything secured against rough travel. Cole walked her through the contents, explaining what went where and why: beans, flour, coffee, salt pork, dried beef, cornmeal, molasses, tools for repair, medical supplies for injuries, spare rope, horseshoes, cooking equipment. Someone has to manage this, Cole said, has to know what we have, what we're using, what we're running low on, has to keep it organized so Cookie can find what he needs fast. Think you can handle that? Margaret studied the wagon's layout, her mind already cataloguing, organizing, seeing patterns in the chaos. Yes. Good. Because if we run out of coffee 3 weeks into the drive, the hands will mutiny. And if we lose track of medical supplies when someone needs them, people die. This matters as much as roping, maybe more. He spent the afternoon teaching her his system, how he tracked supplies on long drives, how to anticipate needs, how to spot waste or theft. Margaret absorbed it like dry ground soaking up rain. This made sense to her in a way cattle work didn't. This was logic and organization and careful planning. This she could do. By evening, she had reorganized one entire section of the wagon, making it more efficient, grouping similar items together in ways that would save Cookie time when he needed something in a hurry. Cole examined her work with careful attention, testing whether she could find specific items quickly, whether the new organization actually improved function. "This works," he said finally. "Better than what we had. You'll manage supplies on the drive." Something warm and solid settled in Margaret's chest, a role, a purpose. Not just tagging along or performing menial labor, but actually contributing something valuable, something she was good at. That evening at supper, Cole made an announcement to the assembled cowboys. "Margaret handles supply management for the drive. You need something, you ask her. She says, 'We're out. We're out.' Her word on supplies is final." Heads turned toward her, expressions ranging from surprise to skepticism to acceptance. Travis caught her eye and grinned. Marcus nodded with what looked like approval. A few others seemed uncertain, withholding judgment. After the meal, as Margaret cleaned tables, one of the older hands approached. His name was Walter Briggs, a weathered man in his 40s who rarely spoke and never smiled. "Supply manager," he said, his tone flat. "That's convenient. Preacher's daughter lands here and gets an easy job while the rest of us break our backs with cattle." Margaret's hands stilled on the table she was wiping. The words stung because they carried the weight of an accusation she had feared, that people would think she received special treatment because of pity or guilt or some obligation Cole felt toward her situation. Before she could respond, Cole's voice cut across the room. "Briggs, my office, now." The dining hall went silent. Briggs's jaw tightened, but he followed Cole outside. Through the window, Margaret could see them talking. Cole's posture rigid, his words clearly clipped and sharp, though she couldn't hear them. Briggs's face went from defensive to resigned to something like chastened. The conversation lasted maybe 3 minutes before Briggs nodded and walked away toward the bunkhouse. Cole returned to the dining hall, his expression unchanged. He picked up his coffee, drained it, and left without acknowledging what had happened. But the message was clear. Margaret's role was not a favor. It was a decision based on capability, and questioning it publicly was not acceptable. Travis appeared at her elbow, his voice low. "Briggs is just bitter. He wanted his nephew hired for the drive, and Cole said no because the kid's unreliable. Briggs is taking it out on you. Maybe he's right, though. Maybe I am getting special treatment. You reorganized that supply wagon better than anyone's done in years. I watched you. That wasn't special treatment. That was you being good at something. Cole needs done." Travis picked up a stack of plates. "Stop looking for reasons to believe the worst about yourself. You're here because you're useful. Accept it." The words settled over Margaret like a physical weight, heavy but anchoring. She was useful. Not just surviving, not just taking up space, but actually contributing something that mattered. The realization shifted something fundamental in how she saw herself. The next morning brought a new challenge. Cole pulled her aside before breakfast, his expression serious. "One of the water barrels has a leak. Need it fixed before we load it for the drive. You and Travis handle it." The barrel sat near the barn, a slow drip staining the ground beneath it. Travis examined the damage, a crack near the bottom where the wood had dried and split. Need to swell the wood back together. That means soaking and pressure. They worked together through the morning, Travis explaining the process while Margaret did most of the physical work. Filling the barrel partially to swell the wood, identifying exactly where the leak originated, cutting a wedge to fit the gap, sealing it with pitch. The work was precise and frustrating, requiring patience and attention to detail. Margaret's hands grew sticky with pitch, her knees aching from kneeling on hard ground. But as the hours passed, the leak slowed, then stopped. When they finally tipped the barrel upright and filled it completely, no water escaped. Travis clapped her on the shoulder. "There you go. That's a skill you didn't have this morning. Small victory, but Margaret counted it. Another piece of knowledge, another capability added to the collection she was slowly building. She would never be the best roper on the ranch, might never have Travis's ease with horses or Cole's instinct with cattle. But she could learn, could add skills one at a time, through failure and repetition and determination. That afternoon, back in the practice corral with the rope, something clicked. Her 20th throw of the day settled cleanly over the wooden steer head, and this time it wasn't luck. She could feel the difference in her hands, the correct weight distribution, the proper release. The next throw succeeded too, then the third. Cole, who had been watching from the fence, nodded once. "Now you're getting it. Do 50 more. I want that success rate above 50%. Margaret's arms screamed in protest, but she kept throwing. Some attempts failed, but more succeeded than ever before. Her body was learning what her mind couldn't quite articulate, the 1,000 small adjustments required to make the rope do what she wanted. By the time Cole called it done, her success rate hovered around 60%, not good enough for real cattle work yet, but no longer embarrassing. "You'll practice every morning before we leave," Cole said. "By the time we start the drive, you need to be at 80%. That's the minimum." "I'll get there." "I know you will." He said it with such certainty that Margaret almost believed it herself. The final days before the drive blurred together in a frenzy of preparation. Margaret managed supplies, organized equipment, practiced roping until her hands developed calluses on top of blisters. She rode with Travis and other hands, learning to work cattle in larger groups, beginning to understand the flow and rhythm of herd movement. She was still not good, but she was no longer hopeless. And in the world of ranch work that represented significant progress. The night before the drive, Cole gathered everyone in the main yard. The chuck wagon stood loaded and ready. Horses rested and shod. Cattle gathered in the main holding pasture. 22 men would make the journey north, along with Margaret. Cookie, the drive's cook, stood beside his wagon, a grizzled man in his 60s who had made this trip a dozen times before. Cole's speech was brief. "We leave at first light. It's 400 miles to the railhead in Kansas. If the weather holds and nothing goes wrong, we'll make it in 6 weeks. but the weather won't hold and things will go wrong. When they do, you handle it, you work together, you watch each other's backs, and you remember that every decision you make affects 22 other people. Be smart, be careful, and when we get to Kansas, you'll have earned what I'm paying you." He looked around the circle of faces, his gaze landing on Margaret last. "Everyone here has a job. Do it. We leave at dawn." The men dispersed toward the bunkhouse, their voices low and serious. Travis caught Margaret as she headed to her room. "You ready for this?" Margaret thought about everything she had learned in 3 weeks. How to ride properly, how to move cattle, how to throw a rope with inconsistent success, how to manage supplies, how to work alongside men who had initially seen her as nothing more than the preacher's shameful burden. "No," she admitted, "but I'm going anyway," Travis laughed. "That's the spirit. Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be long." Margaret lay in her cot that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the ranch settle into quiet. Tomorrow they would leave the relative safety of Red River, head out into open country with 2,000 head of cattle, face whatever challenges the trail put in their path. She was terrified. But beneath the fear ran something else, something bright and fierce that her father had tried to extinguish but had instead inadvertently kindled: purpose. The sense that she was becoming something she had never imagined possible. Not in spite of her father's punishment, but because of it. Margaret closed her eyes. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new failures, new opportunities to prove herself. But tonight, she allowed herself one moment of quiet satisfaction. She had survived 3 weeks, had learned and grown and earned a place, however uncertain, among people who valued work over words. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same stubborn determination that had gotten her this far. Her father had cast her out believing it would break her. Instead, it was forging her into someone he would never recognize. And Margaret was beginning to think that might be the best revenge of all. The drive's 3rd week brought clouds that built like mountains on the western horizon, dark and heavy with the promise of violence. Cole watched them gather as the herd moved north through grassland that stretched endless in every direction, and his jaw tightened with the knowledge of what was coming. They made camp early near a creek bed lined with cottonwoods, the only shelter for miles. The cattle bedded down restlessly, sensing the weather change. Cowboys moved through evening routines with unusual efficiency, everyone understanding that the storm would hit hard and soon. Margaret checked the chuck wagon for the 3rd time, ensuring everything was secured, tied down, protected from wind and rain. Cookie worked beside her, his weathered face grim as he battened down his cooking supplies. "Bad one coming," he muttered. "Can feel it in my bones. Cattle are going to spook." The first drops hit as darkness fell, fat and cold. Within minutes the sky opened. Rain came down in sheets so thick visibility dropped to arm's length. Lightning cracked overhead, thunder following so close. The sound was physical, felt in the chest and bones. The cattle rose as 2,000 animals suddenly on their feet, lowing in distress, their bodies shifting and pressing together. Cowboys scrambled too. Saddle horses, pulling on slickers, shouting orders that were immediately lost in the storm's roar. Cole materialized out of the darkness, rain streaming from his hat. "Margaret, medical supplies where?" "Left side of wagon, 2nd trunk, red mark on the lid." He was gone before she finished speaking, splashing through mud toward where Travis knelt beside a figure on the ground. Margaret couldn't see what had happened through the rain, but her stomach clenched with understanding that someone was hurt. The cattle began to move, not running yet but working themselves toward panic. Every cowboy still capable of riding was in the saddle now, circling the herd, trying to keep them calm, trying to prevent the stampede that lightning and thunder were encouraging with every flash and boom. Cookie grabbed Margaret's arm. "Get in the wagon. Stay there till this passes." But Margaret saw Cole returning, saw him carrying Travis, who was conscious but limping badly, his face twisted with pain. Her horse had kicked him. She understood from their shouted conversation, caught him in the knee when lightning spooked the animal. "He can't ride," Cole said, helping Travis into the chuck wagon's limited shelter. "Knees already swelling. Margaret, stay with him. Cookie, I need you on the remover. 3 horses broke loose, and we need every hand controlling that herd." Cookie hesitated only a second before nodding and disappearing into the storm. Margaret found herself alone with Travis as the full force of the weather descended, the wagon rocking in wind gusts, rain hammering the canvas cover so loud she could barely hear Travis's labored breathing. "Supplies," he gasped through clenched teeth. "Need something for the pain." Margaret's hands shook as she opened the medical trunk, its contents organized exactly as she had arranged them weeks ago. Laudanum, clearly labeled, dosage instructions written in her own careful script. She measured it precisely despite the chaos, helped Travis drink it, watched his face gradually relax as the medicine took hold. "Thanks," he managed. "Sorry I'm useless now." "You're not useless. You're hurt. There's a difference." She examined his knee as best she could in the dim light of a single lantern, the swelling already pronounced, the joint hot to the touch. Not broken, she thought, but badly damaged. Travis would be lucky to walk without a limp for the next month. Outside, the storm raged for 3 hours. Margaret stayed with Travis, keeping him warm, monitoring his condition, occasionally peering through the canvas to try to see what was happening with the herd. Lightning illuminated brief snapshots. Cowboys on horseback, barely visibly through rain, the dark mass of cattle constantly threatening to break into full stampede. At some point around midnight, the wind shifted. The rain continued, but the lightning moved east, thunder growing more distant. The cattle settled by degrees, their panic receding as the immediate threat passed. Near dawn, Cole returned to the wagon, soaked to the skin, his face haggard with exhaustion. He looked at Travis, then at Margaret. "How is he?" "Knees badly hurt but stable. I gave him laudanum for the pain. He needs rest and cold compresses when we can manage them." Cole nodded slowly. "You did good. Real good." He paused. "We lost 12 head over the North Ridge. Found them at first light in a ravine. Also lost 2 horses to the remover panic, and Marcus took a fall that bruised his ribs. Could have been worse. Would have been worse if you hadn't kept Travis stable and known exactly where the medical supplies were when I needed them. That's just organization. That's the difference between chaos and chaos. Control." Cole's voice was rough with fatigue. "Half the drives I've been on, nobody knows where anything is when an emergency hits. People die from that. You prevented it." He climbed down from the wagon, then looked back. "Get some rest. We're staying here today to let everyone recover. You've earned it." But Margaret couldn't rest. With Travis immobile and several hands injured, the work of breaking camp and managing supplies fell more heavily on those remaining. She spent the day reorganizing equipment that had shifted in the storm, taking inventory of what was damaged or lost, calculating whether they had enough provisions to make it to the next settlement or if they needed to adjust plans. Cookie found her mid-afternoon, working through the supply trunk with methodical precision. He watched for a moment before speaking. "You know what you're doing with this. It's just counting and tracking. It's keeping people alive." Cookie sat on the wagon's edge, his old bones creaking. "I've been on drives where the supply manager was drunk half the time, where we ran out of coffee because nobody was paying attention, where someone died because we couldn't find bandages when we needed them. You're good at this. Better than most I've worked with." The words landed with unexpected weight. Cookie didn't give praise lightly. Margaret had learned that about him in 3 weeks of working alongside him. He was economical with everything, including compliments. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. Cole was smart to put you in this role." Cookie stood, wincing as his knees protested. "And for what it's worth, Whatever your father said about you being sinful or shameful, or whatever nonsense preachers spew, he was wrong. You're one of the most useful people on this drive." He walked away before Margaret could respond, leaving her sitting in the wagon with something warm and solid building in her chest. Useful, capable, good at what she did. Not in spite of being a woman, not as a surprise given her background, but simply as fact. That evening, with Travis resting more comfortably and the camp settling into recovery, Cole found Margaret checking on the remover horses, making notes about which ones showed signs of strain from the Aspie. "Storm, walk with me." They moved away from the camp, toward where the creek ran quieter now, the storm's fury spent. The sunset painted the western sky in shades of orange and purple, the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth. Cole didn't speak immediately, and Margaret had learned that his silences meant he was working through something important. She waited, listening to the creek and the distant sound of cattle settling for the night. "I was wrong about something," he said finally. Margaret glanced at him, surprised. "When your father left you at the ranch, I thought I was getting a burden I'd have to carry out of decency. Someone who'd need constant supervision, constant help, who'd slow us down and need protecting." He picked up a smooth stone, turned it over in his hands. "I was wrong. You've earned your place here. Not through luck or sympathy, but through work and capability. I'm still not good with cattle. You're adequate with cattle. You're excellent with organization, logistics, keeping things running. Every operation needs both kinds of people. I've got 15 hands who can rope and ride but can't plan worth a damn. Having someone who can think ahead, anticipate problems, keep supplies managed, that's worth more than another mediocre roper." He threw the stone into the creek, the splash loud in the quiet. "What I'm saying is you've proven yourself. To me, to the men, to everyone on this drive. Whatever shame your father tried to mark you with, you've erased it through your actions." Margaret's throat tightened. He said, "Teaching that woman to read made me sinful, that associating with her corrupted me. Your father's understanding of sin is small and cruel." Cole turned to face her fully. "You showed mercy to someone who needed it. That's not corruption, that's courage." The words broke something open inside her, some last defended place where her father's judgment still held weight. Margaret felt tears threaten and fought them back, refusing to cry even though Cole's recognition of what she had done, what she had been punished for, cut deeper than any criticism ever had. "Thank you," she whispered. Cole stepped closer, and suddenly the air between them felt charged with something beyond respect or acknowledgement. His hand lifted, hesitated, then gently touched her cheek, his calloused fingers rough but careful. "You're remarkable," he said quietly. "Not despite what you've been through, but because of how you've handled it. Your father tried to break you with shame and exile. Instead, you've become someone stronger than you were in his world." Margaret's heart hammered. She had noticed Cole over the weeks. How could she not? His quiet competence, his fairness, the way he commanded respect without demanding it. But she had not let herself imagine he might see her as more than a worker, more than someone he felt obligated to protect. His thumb brushed across her cheekbone, a question in the gesture. Margaret answered by leaning forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met carefully at first, testing, then with more certainty. The kiss tasted like creek water and dust, and something indefinably right. When they parted, Cole's hand remained on her face, his eyes searching hers. "Is this what you want?" "Yes." No hesitation, no doubt. "Your father would call it another sin. My father's judgment stopped mattering to me the day he left me standing in your ranch yard." Margaret's voice was steady, sure. "I choose this. I choose you. I choose this life." Cole kissed her again, longer this time, his other hand finding her waist, pulling her closer. When they finally broke apart, both breathing harder, he rested his forehead against hers. "When we get to Kansas, when this drive is done, I want you to stay at Red River, not as hired help, as my partner, in the ranch and in life." He pulled back enough to see her face clearly. "I'm asking you to marry me, Margaret. Not out of obligation or pity, but because I want you beside me. Because you make everything better just by being capable and determined and unwilling to quit." Margaret couldn't speak, past the emotion lodged in her throat. She nodded, tears finally spilling over despite her best efforts. Cole kissed them away, his lips gentle on her cheeks. "Is that a yes?" "Yes." The word came out broken but certain. "Yes." They stood by the creek as twilight deepened into night, holding each other while stars emerged overhead. Back at camp, men settled around fires, tending injuries, telling storm stories, completely unaware that their boss and the preacher's daughter had just committed themselves to each other beside quiet water. When they finally returned, walking close but not touching some things needed to be private still, Travis looked up from where he sat, with his leg elevated and a slow grin spread across his face. "About time," he said softly, for Margaret's ears only as she checked his bandages. "Excuse me? Cole's been watching you like you hung the moon for 2 weeks now." Wasn't hard to see where it was heading. Travis winced as Margaret adjusted the compress on his knee. "He's a good man, fair and honest. You could do worse. I could do worse than someone who sees me as capable rather than shameful." "Exactly." Travis's grin faded into something more serious. "Your father was a fool, but his foolishness brought you to the right place. Funny how that works sometimes." The next morning brought clear skies and the need to move the herd onward. Travis remained in the chuck wagon, unable to ride, which meant Margaret took on even more of the supply management, while Cookie focused on keeping Travis comfortable and fed. The rhythm of the drive resumed, but something had shifted. The cowboys, who had been cautiously accepting now, showed Margaret frank respect. When she made decisions about rationing supplies or adjusting schedules, they followed without question. When she needed help moving heavy equipment, hands appeared without her having to ask. Walter Briggs, who had questioned her role weeks earlier, approached her one evening as she inventoried rope supplies. He stood awkwardly, hat in his hands, clearly uncomfortable. "Miss Pritchard, I owe you an apology." Margaret looked up, surprised. "I said you got your job through special treatment. I was wrong. You earned it. What you did during that storm, keeping Travis stable and knowing exactly where everything was that saved lives. I was bitter about my nephew and took it out on you. That wasn't right." "Apology accepted," Margaret said simply. Briggs nodded, relief crossing his face. He started to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, you're better at this job than most men I've worked with. Your father was a fool to cast you out." After he left, Margaret sat alone with the inventory ledger, staring at rows of numbers that had become as familiar as scripture once was. She thought about her father, about his certainty that he was right, that his judgment was godly, that exiling her was righteous punishment. He had been so wrong. About her, about sin, about what mattered in the world. His narrow understanding of righteousness had blinded him to actual goodness, teaching someone to read, showing mercy, working hard, contributing to something larger than yourself. Margaret had discovered more grace in 3 weeks of ranch work than in 19 years of her father's preaching, had found more acceptance among rough cowboys than in her father's carefully constructed religious world, had proven more worthy by managing supplies and learning cattle work than by memorizing scripture and performing piety. Her father's punishment had freed her to become someone she never could have been under his roof. And for that, perversely, she was almost grateful. The drive continued north, days blending together in the endless rhythm of moving cattle, making camp, pushing forward. Margaret's role solidified until it was simply understood that she ran supplies, that her word on resources was final, that when something went wrong, she would know where to find what was needed. Travis's knee healed slowly, and Margaret tended it with the same methodical care she applied to everything else. Cookie taught her basic wound care, how to recognize infection, when to worry, and when to let the body heal itself. Another skill added to her growing collection. Cole and Margaret stole moments when they could brief conversations after the camp settled, walks away from the fires under star-filled skies, stolen kisses in the pre-dawn darkness before the day's work began. They kept it quiet, both understanding that some things were private, that their relationship was nobody's business until they chose to make it so. But the men knew. Cowboys always knew. And their knowing came with acceptance, even approval. They had watched Margaret earn her place, had seen Cole treat her fairly, demand the same from her as from anyone else, reward her competence without favoritism. If their boss had chosen the preacher's daughter, they figured he had chosen well. One evening, as Margaret organized supplies by lantern light, she heard singing from the campfire. One of the hands had pulled out a battered harmonica, and rough voices joined together in an old trail song, off-key but heartfelt. Travis, limping but mobile now, appeared at the wagon. "They want you to join them." "I don't sing. Doesn't matter. It's not about singing well. It's about being part of the group." Margaret set down her ledger and followed Travis to the fire. The men made space for her on a log, someone handed her a tin cup of terrible coffee, and the singing continued. She didn't know all the words, but she learned them as they repeated, her voice quiet at first, then stronger. Cole sat across the fire, watching her with an expression she was learning to read. Pride, affection, satisfaction. She met his eyes and smiled, and the moment held between them like a promise. Later, when the fire burned low and men drifted toward bedrolls, Cole walked Margaret to the chuck wagon where she slept. They stood close in the darkness, his hand finding hers. "We're 10 days from Kansas," he said. "When we get there, when the cattle are sold and the men are paid, I want to make this official. Find a preacher, say vows, start building something permanent. My father would never approve. Good thing his approval stopped mattering." Cole squeezed her hand. "You're mine, and I'm yours. Everything else is just details." Margaret leaned against him, feeling his strength, his certainty, his absolute conviction that they were building something worth keeping. "I never imagined my life could look like this. Better than what your father planned for you. Infinitely better." They kissed goodnight, and Margaret climbed into the wagon to sleep, surrounded by supplies she had organized, among people who valued her work, heading toward a future she had chosen rather than one imposed upon her. Her father had meant her exile as an ending. Instead, it had been a beginning. And as Margaret drifted towards sleep, listening to the night sounds of the drive, she felt nothing but gratitude for the punishment that had accidentally set her free. The town of Abilene sprawled along the railroad tracks, a chaos of cattle pens and saloons and merchants eager to separate cowboys from their pay. Cole brought the herd to the holding pens on the town's eastern edge, 2,000 head after 6 weeks on the trail, the animals lean but healthy, ready for sale and shipment east. The drive had gone well. Better than well. Only 12 head lost to the storm, no major injuries beyond Travis's knee. Supplies managed so efficiently they arrived with food to spare. Cole walked among his men that first evening in town, paying out wages, shaking hands, telling them they had done good work. Margaret stood near the chuck wagon, settling final accounts, with Cookie checking off the last items in her ledger. The numbers balanced perfectly, every pound of flour and coffee accounted for, every medical supply tracked. She closed the book with satisfaction, 6 weeks of meticulous record-keeping complete. Cole found her as dusk settled over the pens, the sounds of the town drifting on evening air, music from saloons, laughter, the constant lowing of cattle waiting for shipment. He carried a small leather pouch that clinked with coin. "Your wages," he said, pressing it into her hands. "Same as any hand, plus bonus for supply management. You earned every cent." Margaret hefted the pouch, surprised by its weight. More money than she had ever held in her life. Enough to buy passage anywhere, start fresh somewhere new if she chose. Enough to be independent, to make her own decisions, to never rely on anyone's charity or pity again. "Thank you." Cole's hand covered hers, his thumb tracing circles on her wrist. "We will sell the herd tomorrow. Day after, we head back to the Red River, and when we get there, you and I are getting married. That's still what you want? More than anything." "Good." He kissed her forehead, a gesture that had become familiar over the weeks, grounding and reassuring. "Get cleaned up. I'm taking you to dinner at the hotel. A real meal at a real table. You've earned that too." The hotel restaurant was modest but clean. White tablecloths and actual china plates, food that wasn't cooked over an open fire. Margaret wore the only dress she owned, the one Maria had given her that first day, mended now in several places but clean and pressed. She felt strange in it after weeks in canvas trousers and work shirts, exposed and formal in a way that no longer felt natural. Cole wore his town clothes, his hair slicked back, beard trimmed. He looked different, cleaned up, more refined, though his eyes held the same steady strength she had learned to depend on. They ate slowly, talking about the drive, about the ranch, about plans for expanding the herd next year. "I want to build onto the main house," Cole said. "Add rooms for a proper family, space for children eventually if that's something you want." Margaret's chest tightened with emotion she couldn't quite name. Children, a family. A future that extended beyond simple survival into something rich and full of possibility. "I'd like that." They were finishing dessert when the restaurant door opened and Silas Pritchard walked in. Margaret saw him first. Her entire body went rigid, her fork clattering against the plate. Cole turned immediately, following her gaze, his hand dropping to rest near his hip in a gesture that was instinctive and protective. Silas looked older than Margaret remembered, his face more lined, his shoulders slightly stooped, but his eyes held the same certainty, the same absolute conviction in his own righteousness. He scanned the room, found Margaret, and his expression hardened into something between vindication and anger. He crossed the restaurant without hesitation, his boots striking the floor with deliberate force. Conversations quieted as people noticed the preacher's intensity, the way he moved like a man on a mission from God himself. Margaret. Her name in his mouth sounded like an accusation. She forced herself to meet his eyes, to keep her spine straight even as her heart hammered. "Father, I have been searching for you for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of following rumors, tracking wagon trains, asking after a girl matching your description, working cattle drives." His voice carried across the quiet restaurant, meant to be heard, to create an audience. "Imagine my horror, learning that my daughter, whom I cast out for disobedience and sin, has been living among cowboys, working as a common laborer, degrading herself further with every passing day." Cole started to rise, but Margaret touched his arm, stopping him. This was her confrontation to handle. She had earned that right. "I'm working, Father, honest work, managing supplies, keeping records, contributing to something worthwhile. Honest?" Silas's laugh was bitter. "You're living among men without protection, without proper supervision, dressed in trousers like a man yourself. You've abandoned every principle I taught you, every standard of decent behavior. You've proven that my initial judgment was correct. You are corrupted beyond redemption." Margaret stood slowly, her hands steady, despite the trembling that wanted to take over her limbs. Around them, the restaurant had gone completely silent. every diner watching the drama unfold. "You didn't cast me out for corruption," she said, her voice carrying clearly. "You cast me out because I showed kindness to someone you deemed unworthy. Because I taught a woman to read when you said she should remain ignorant. Because I dared to suggest that mercy might matter more than maintaining your reputation for righteousness." Silas's face flushed dark. "I cast you out for disobedience, for rebellion against godly authority, for choosing sin over submission." "No." Margaret stepped away from the table, away from Cole's protective presence, standing on her own. "You cast me out because your pride mattered more than your daughter, because maintaining your image as a perfect preacher was more important than actual love or actual grace. You were afraid that my actions would taint your reputation, so you eliminated the problem. You treated me like cargo, like payment, like something disposable. I treated you as your behavior warranted. You treated me like I was worthless." Margaret's voice rose, powered by 6 weeks of hard work and earned respect and discovering what she was actually capable of. "You handed me over to a stranger and rode away without looking back. You made a public spectacle of my shame because you needed witnesses to your righteousness. You cared more about what people thought than about what happened to me." The restaurant was absolutely silent now, every person transfixed by the confrontation. Silas's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw working as he struggled for control. "I came here to bring you home," he said, his voice tight, "to give you one final chance at redemption, to allow you to repent of this degradation and return to proper living. But I see now that you are too far gone, too corrupted by the world to recognize salvation when it's offered." "I don't need your salvation." Margaret's hands trembled, but her voice held firm. "I don't need your approval or your redemption or your version of what proper living looks like. I've spent 6 weeks learning skills you never taught me, contributing to something you never valued, discovering strengths you told me I didn't possess. I've earned respect through work rather than inherited it through piety. And I've learned that your understanding of God's grace is small and cruel and completely wrong." Silas took a step forward, his hand rising as if to strike her. Cole was on his feet instantly, moving between them with deadly speed, his presence a physical barrier that Silas would have to go through to reach Margaret. "Touch her and I'll break your arm." Cole said quietly, the words all the more threatening for their lack of volume. "She's told you her choice. You need to accept it." Silas looked at Cole with undisguised contempt. "And who are you?" "The man I paid with human currency. The rancher who accepted a girl as wages and now parades her around like she's respectable. I'm the man who gave her a chance when you gave her nothing but shame," Cole replied, his voice still dangerously quiet. "I'm the man who watched her work harder than most cowboys I've hired, who saw her manage supplies better than anyone I've known, who recognized her worth when you were too blind with pride to see it. And I'm the man who's going to marry her, with or without your blessing." The revelation hung in the air, shocking in its directness. Margaret's heart hammered, but she stepped forward to stand beside Cole, taking his hand in hers. "He's right," she said. "Cole asked me to marry him. I said yes. We're building a life together, Father, a life where I'm valued for what I contribute, not condemned for who I am. A life where showing mercy isn't called sin, where working hard is respected, where I don't have to constantly prove I'm righteous enough to deserve basic dignity." Silas stared at their joined hands as if witnessing something obscene. "You would marry him? A common rancher? You would throw away any hope of redemption, any chance at proper society for this?" "Yes." No hesitation, no doubt, because this is real, this is honest. This is a life built on work and respect, and actually caring about other people rather than just appearing righteous. "Then you are dead to me." Silas's voice cracked, rage and something that might have been pain mixing in his tone. "I tried to save you. I gave you every opportunity to repent, to return to the path of righteousness. But you have chosen degradation over dignity, worldly corruption over spiritual purity. You are no daughter of mine. I haven't been your daughter since the day you left me standing in Cole's ranch yard, Margaret replied. You ended that relationship when you valued your reputation more than my life. I'm just acknowledging what you made true 6 weeks ago. Around them, the restaurant remained frozen, witnesses to the complete severing of family ties. But something was shifting in the crowd. A woman at a nearby table stood, her hand going to Margaret's shoulder. I heard what you did, miss, she said softly. Teaching that saloon girl to read. That took courage. Your father's wrong to call it sin. An older man cleared his throat. Been on cattle drives myself. Supply management's one of the hardest jobs there is. If you did that well enough to bring a herd through 6 weeks without running short, that's something to be proud of, not ashamed of. One by one, other diners began speaking up, offering quiet affirmations, recognition of Margaret's worth that stood in stark contrast to her father's condemnation. They were strangers, people who knew nothing about her beyond what they had just witnessed, but they saw something. Her father refused to acknowledge that she had value beyond her ability to conform to his narrow standards. Silas looked around the restaurant, seeing his authority challenged by ordinary people, his righteousness questioned by strangers who should have supported a preacher over a wayward girl. His face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, confusion, and finally something close to desperation. You don't understand, he said, addressing the room now rather than Margaret. She defied godly authority, she was associated with sinners, she refused correction and chose rebellion. A father has a duty to discipline such behavior, to protect his daughter from her own corruption. A father has a duty to love his daughter, the woman beside Margaret said firmly. To protect her, yes, but from real harm, not from showing kindness to someone in need. What you call discipline looks an awful lot like cruelty from where I'm standing. Cole's hand tightened on Margaret's, his voice carrying across the room. Every person here can see what you can't, Reverend. Your daughter isn't corrupted. She's brave. She's capable. She's shown more real grace in 6 weeks of honest work than you've shown in years of preaching. You had a chance to recognize that, to be proud of her. You chose pride over love. That's on you, not her. The words landed like physical blows. Margaret watched her father's face cycle through emotions, watched him grapple with being publicly challenged, with having his judgment questioned by people who should have deferred to his spiritual authority. You will regret this, Silas said finally, his voice shaking. All of you. When judgment comes, when you stand before God and account for encouraging rebellion and sin, you will remember this moment and wish you had chosen differently. He turned toward the door, his movements stiff with barely controlled fury. But before he left, he looked back at Margaret one final time. I prayed you would come to your senses, that exile would teach you humility, that hardship would break your stubborn pride. Instead, it has only hardened you further. You are lost, Margaret, beyond saving, and I wash my hands of you. Good, Margaret said quietly, because I'm saving myself, and I don't need your hands for that. Silas left without another word, the door swinging shut behind him with finality. The silence in the restaurant held for a long moment before conversations gradually resumed, people returning to their meals, though many eyes still flickered toward Margaret with expressions ranging from sympathy to admiration. Margaret's legs suddenly felt weak. She sat down hard. Cole's arm immediately around her shoulders, steadying her. The trembling she had suppressed during the confrontation took over, her hands shaking, her breath coming in shallow gasps. You did it, Cole murmured against her hair. You stood up to him. You chose yourself over his control. I thought it would feel different, Margaret whispered. I thought I'd feel relieved or vindicated. I just feel hollow. That's normal. You just cut the last tie to your old life. That's hard, even when it's necessary. Cole's hand rubbed gentle circles on her back. But you also just claimed your new life completely. Made it real in a way it wasn't before. That takes incredible courage. Travis appeared at their table, limping but mobile, his face concerned. Heard there was a commotion. Everyone, all right? Margaret's father tried to reclaim her, Cole explained. She told him no. Travis let out a low whistle. Good for you. That couldn't have been easy. It wasn't. Margaret's voice was still shaky, but it was necessary. The woman who had spoken up earlier approached their table, her expression kind. I'm Rebecca Thornton. My husband and I run the general store here in town. I just wanted to say you handled that with more grace than most people could manage. Your father may not see your worth, but the rest of us do. Thank you, Margaret managed. Other diners stopped by as they finished their meal, offering similar words of support, recognition, solidarity. By the time they left the restaurant, Margaret felt less hollow and more anchored. Her father's rejection stung, but these strangers' acceptance based on nothing but what they had witnessed of her character helped fill the space his abandonment left behind. Cole walked her back toward the cattle pens where the chuck wagon was parked, his arm around her waist, keeping her close. The night air was cool, carrying sounds from the saloons and the constant presence of cattle. Your father will tell his version of this story, Cole said. He'll preach about your corruption, about his righteous judgment, about the dangers of rebellion. You know that, right? I know, but anyone who actually knows you will see through it. The men on the drive, the people at the ranch, anyone who's watched you work, they know the truth. Margaret leaned into him, drawing strength from his solidity. I don't regret it. Standing up to him, choosing this life. I just wish... She stopped, not sure how to finish. Wish he could have been different. Wish he could have been the father I needed instead of the preacher he wanted to be. Margaret wiped at her eyes, frustrated by the tears that wanted to fall. Is that foolish? It's human. Cole stopped walking, turned her to face him. You deserved better than what he gave you. You deserved a father who saw your kindness as strength, your independence as an asset, your questions as intelligence rather than rebellion. The fact that you didn't get that isn't your fault. He called me dead to him. Then he's the one who lost something valuable, not you. Cole cupped her face in his hands. You're building a life without him, a good life, an honest life, and you're doing it with people who actually value you. That's not a loss. That's victory. Margaret kissed him, pouring everything she felt into it, gratitude, love, fear, determination, relief. When they parted, both breathing hard, Cole rested his forehead against hers. Let's go home, he said, back to Red River, get married, build the life we talked about. Show your father and everyone else that the punishment he meant to destroy you actually made you stronger than you ever could have been under his roof. Yes, Margaret whispered. Let's go home. They stood together in the darkness outside the cattle pens, the town's chaos swirling around them, the future stretching out full of possibility and choice. Margaret's father had tried one final time to reclaim control, to break her will, to force her back into the narrow confines of his righteous world. He had failed, completely and utterly failed. And in failing, he had given Margaret the final gift she needed, absolute freedom from his judgment, his authority, his version of what her life should be. The confrontation had been painful, would probably hurt for years in ways she couldn't yet anticipate, but it had also been necessary. The final severing of chains she had been dragging since childhood, the complete rejection of a worldview that made her small and shameful and wrong. Margaret Pritchard was done being her father's failure, done being his punishment case, done being the daughter who needed to be broken into righteousness. She was ready to become Margaret Hayes, ranch manager, supply expert, partner to a good man, builder of a life that mattered not because it looked righteous, but because it was real and honest and built on work that helped people rather than condemned them. Her father's punishment was over. Margaret's life was just beginning, and she had never been more certain that she was exactly where she belonged. The return journey to Red River Ranch took 3 weeks, moving at a pace dictated by tired horses and men eager to reach home. Margaret rode the best now with confidence, no longer relegated to the chuck wagon, her seat in the saddle as natural as breathing. The men who had questioned her presence months ago now rode alongside her as equals, swapping trail stories, asking her opinion on supply routes for next year's drive. Travis, his knee healed enough for light riding, caught up with her one afternoon as they crossed a shallow creek. You know what's funny? When you first showed up, half the men took bets on how long you'd last. Most figured 3 days, maybe a week if you were stubborn. And now, they're asking Mr. Hayes if you'll be managing supplies for all future drives. You've set a standard nobody wants to see lowered. He grinned. Made me $5 winning that bet, by the way. I said you'd last the whole drive. Only the whole drive. I'm honest, not clairvoyant. Didn't know you'd end up marrying the boss and becoming part of the ranch permanently. Margaret smiled, scanning the horizon where the land rolled in endless waves of grass. Neither did I. Red River Ranch appeared on the horizon at sunset 3 days later, the buildings golden in fading light, smoke rising from the cook shack where Maria would be preparing supper. The sight hit Margaret with unexpected force. This place that had been a punishment destination now looked like coming home. Cole rode there beside her, close enough that their stirrups nearly touched. What do you think? Still want to stay here? More than ever. They brought the horses in, the remover settling into familiar corrals, dust rising around hooves that had traveled 800 miles and were finally done. Cowboys dispersed toward the bunkhouse, calling out greetings to men who had stayed behind to manage the ranch during the drive. Maria appeared on the cook shack steps, her hands on her hips, a smile breaking across her weathered face when she spotted Margaret. You survived, she called out. I wasn't sure you would. Neither was I, Margaret admitted, dismounting and leading Bess toward the barn. But here I am. And here you'll stay if the look on Mr. Hayes's face means what I think it means. Maria's eyes sparkled with knowing. That man's been different since he met you. Lighter somehow. Like he finally found something he didn't know he was missing. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. He asked me to marry him. Of course he did. He'd be a fool not to. Maria pulled her into a brief, fierce hug. Welcome home, girl. Truly home. The wedding took place 2 weeks later on a Saturday afternoon with clear skies and the whole ranch gathered as witnesses. They held it outside near the creek that ran through the eastern pasture, cottonwoods providing shade, wildflowers blooming in scattered patches across the grass. No church, no formal altar. Just open land and people who mattered. The circuit judge from town performed the ceremony, his words simple and direct. Margaret wore a new dress, pale blue cotton that Maria and the judge's wife had helped her sew, her hair pulled back but not severe, soft around her face. Cole wore his best suit, looking uncomfortable in formal clothes, but steady as stone when he took Margaret's hands. Do you, Margaret Pritchard, take this man? I do, she said it before the judge finished, unable to wait, needing the words said and witnessed and made real. Cole's smile broke wide across his face. Eager, aren't we? Just certain. When the judge pronounced them married, Cole kissed her in front of 23 ranch hands, Maria, Cookie, Travis, Marcus, and half a dozen neighbors who had ridden over for the occasion. Whistles and applause rang out, genuine and celebratory, these rough men acknowledging something good and right happening among them. The celebration lasted into the night. Tables set up outside, food appearing in quantities that suggested Maria had been planning this for weeks. Someone produced a fiddle, another a harmonica, and impromptu dancing began as stars emerged overhead. Margaret danced with Cole, with Travis, with Marcus, with cowboys who had watched her transformation from shameful burden to capable partner. Walter Briggs approached late in the evening, slightly drunk, his eyes wet. "Your father's a damn fool," he announced, too loud, "throwing away a daughter like you. My nephew, the one I wanted hired, he's worthless. Can't keep a job, can't be trusted. But I kept defending him because he's family. Your pa had someone actually worth keeping, and he couldn't see it. That's tragedy right there." "Thank you, Walter," Margaret said gently, steadying him when he swayed. "Me ain't it. You're good people. Mr. Hayes chose well." Cole found her later, pulling her away from the celebration toward the creek where moonlight painted everything silver. They stood close, his arms around her waist, her head against his chest. "Happy?" he asked. "Impossibly happy." Margaret looked up at the stars, scattered thick across the dark sky. "6 months ago, I was standing in this ranch yard, being handed over like payment for services rendered. Now I'm married to the man who received me, working beside him, building something real. It doesn't seem possible. Your father meant it as the end of your story. Instead, it was the beginning. The best beginning I could have asked for." They stayed by the creek while the party continued in the distance, music and laughter drifting on the night air, celebrating not just a wedding, but Margaret's complete transition from exile to belonging. The first year of marriage brought changes that rippled through the ranch's operations. Margaret's role expanded beyond supply management into broader ranch logistics. She developed systems for tracking cattle health, breeding records, seasonal rotation, schedules. Her organizational mind, freed from simply managing supplies, began reshaping how the entire ranch functioned. Cole trusted her judgment, implementing her suggestions even when they challenged established practices. When Margaret proposed changing the spring branding schedule to reduce stress on newborn calves, he backed her completely. When she suggested hiring 2 additional hands specifically for fence maintenance, a role most ranchers considered unnecessary, he saw the logic and made it happen. The ranch prospered. Cattle stayed healthier with Margaret's systematic approach to herd management. Equipment lasted longer with proper maintenance schedules. Supply costs dropped because nothing was wasted or forgotten. By the second year, Red River Ranch was producing 20% more beef with the same acreage, and neighboring ranchers started asking questions about how Hayes managed it. "It's his wife," Travis told visitors who came seeking advice. "She runs this place like a military operation. Everything tracked, everything planned, nothing left to chance. We thought she was crazy at first with all her ledgers and schedules. Now we can't imagine operating without her system." Word spread. Other ranchers started adopting Margaret's methods, implementing tracking systems, organizing supply management with more rigor. Her cattle association invited Cole to speak at their annual meeting, but he brought Margaret instead. She stood before 200 ranchers in a meeting hall in San Antonio, the only woman in the room, and explained her approach to herd management and supply logistics. Some men looked skeptical. Others took notes frantically. By the end, 3 ranchers offered her consultant fees to come assess their operations. "I'm not interested in consulting," she told them, "but I'll write down my methods. Anyone who wants to implement them is welcome to the information." She spent the winter drafting a comprehensive guide to ranch management, her careful handwriting filling page after page, with procedures, schedules, tracking forms, supply formulas. Cole had it printed at his own expense, distributed free to any rancher who requested it. Within 2 years, the Hayes system was being used across Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. Margaret's name became known not as the preacher's shameful daughter, but as the woman who revolutionized cattle ranch efficiency. Letters arrived from as far as Montana and Wyoming, ranchers asking questions, requesting clarification, sharing their own improvements to her methods. The third year brought a different kind of recognition. A writer for Harper's Weekly came to Red River, asking to document the famous Margaret Hayes, whose innovations were changing the cattle industry. Margaret initially refused, uncomfortable with publicity. But Cole convinced her. People should know your story, not the version your father tells, but the real one. How hard work and intelligence matter more than arbitrary judgments. About worthiness. The article appeared that summer, titled From Exile to Excellence, How Margaret Hayes Transformed Texas Ranching. It told her story with honesty, her father's rejection, her arrival at Red River, her determination to prove herself, her marriage to Cole, and her systematic approach to ranch management that was now spreading across the West. The article mentioned Silas Pritchard by name, describing his decision to cast out his daughter for teaching a saloon girl to read. It presented the facts without editorializing, letting readers draw their own conclusions about a preacher who valued reputation over mercy. Responses poured in. Letters from women who had faced similar rejection from families, from men who recognized Margaret's competence, from other preachers who argued that Silas had misunderstood the gospel he claimed to preach. A few letters defended Silas, calling Margaret's defiancy proof of corruption. But those were vastly outnumbered by expressions of support and admiration. Margaret kept one letter, tucked in her desk drawer. It came from Rose, the saloon girl she had taught to read. "Dear Margaret, I read about you in Harper's. I'm so proud of you, and so grateful you didn't listen to your father when he said teaching me was sin. Because of you, I can read now. I left the saloon 2 years ago, got work as a seamstress. I read every night, mostly scripture. I found the grace your father said didn't exist for people like me. Thank you for seeing me as worth helping. Your kindness changed my life." Rose Margaret cried when she read it, showing Cole the letter with trembling hands. This is what mattered, not the ranch efficiency or the recognition or any of it. This, one person helped toward a better life. You've helped more than one, Cole reminded her. But yes, this is what your father couldn't see. That's showing mercy to one person, teaching them to read, treating them as worthy that mattered more than maintaining his perfect reputation. The fourth year brought twins, a boy and a girl, born in the ranch house with Maria attending and Cole pacing outside like a caged animal. Margaret recovered quickly, determined not to let motherhood slow her work. She managed the ranch from her bed for 2 weeks, ledgers spread around her, babies sleeping in a cradle Cole had built himself. "You're supposed to rest," Maria scolded, finding Margaret reviewing supply orders 3 days after giving birth. "I am resting. I'm just resting while working." The twins Sarah and James grew up in the ranch house, surrounded by ledgers and cowboys, learning to walk between corrals and cattle pens. By age 3, Sarah could count inventory faster than most ranch hands. James showed his mother's organizational mind, arranging his toys in careful systems that made perfect sense to him. Margaret taught them reading and arithmetic herself, using the same patient approach she had used with Rose years earlier. She taught them scripture, too, but differently than her father had taught her. Not as weapon or condemnation, but as story and wisdom and invitation to think critically. "Your grandfather was a preacher," she told them when they were old enough to ask about family. "But we don't see him. He made choices that hurt people, including me. Sometimes families break, and that's sad, but it's also sometimes necessary." She never spoke with bitterness, only honesty. Her father's rejection had shaped her life, but it no longer defined it. She had built something too substantial, too real, too good to be diminished by one man's narrow judgment. Years passed in the rhythm of ranch life. Spring brandings, summer drives, fall preparations, winter maintenance. Margaret's systems became so integrated into Red River's operations that younger hands couldn't imagine the ranch functioning any other way. She trained each new hire personally, teaching them her methods, expecting the same precision she demanded of herself. Some hands struggled with her exacting standards. A few quit, unable or unwilling to meet her requirements. But most thrived, discovering that systematic organization made their work easier rather than harder, that knowing exactly where everything was and exactly what was needed saved time and frustration. Margaret's reputation grew beyond ranching circles. The Women's Temperance Union invited her to speak about women's capabilities in traditionally male spaces. Suffrage organizations cited her success as evidence that women deserved equal standing. Margaret accepted some invitations, declined others, choosing carefully where she spent her time. "I'm not interested in being a symbol," she told Cole, after turning down yet another speaking request. "I just want to run this ranch well and raise our children and live the life we've built." "You're a symbol whether you want to be or not," Cole pointed out. "Woman who took her father's punishment and transformed it into success, who proved that mercy matters more than judgment. That's a story people need to hear. Then they can read about it in Harper's. I've got a fence repair scheduled to finalize and a new hand to train. That's more important than giving speeches." But she did write, published 3 more detailed guides on different aspects of ranch management, all distributed free to anyone who requested them. Corresponded with dozens of ranchers implementing her systems, offering advice, troubleshooting problems, celebrating their successes. A decade after arriving at Red River as punishment for showing mercy, Margaret Hayes was one of the most respected names in cattle ranching. Not despite being a woman, but simply because she was exceptional at what she did. Her father's preaching circuit continued, though with diminishing influence. Stories about his rejection of his capable daughter spread wider than his sermons. People who had once filled his tent revivals now attended in smaller numbers, questioning a man who called teaching someone to read a sin worthy of exile. Silas never reached out to reconcile, never acknowledged Margaret's success or admitted error in his judgment. He remained convinced that his daughter was corrupted, that her worldly success proved nothing about her spiritual state, that his righteous condemnation had been proper and necessary. Margaret stopped waiting for his apology after the first year, stopped hoping he might see her worth after the second. By the 5th year, she rarely thought about him, except when someone asked about family. He had become a figure from her past, someone who shaped her early life but held no power over her present. The ranch house Cole built had 7 rooms, large windows facing east to catch morning light, a wide porch where Margaret often sat with her ledgers while Sarah and James played in the yard. The walls held photographs of cattle drives and ranch gatherings, nothing religious, nothing formal, just documentation of a life built through work and purpose. One evening, 15 years after her father had cast her out, Margaret sat on that porch with Cole beside her, watching the sun set behind the western pastures. Their children were inside, Sarah helping James with arithmetic while arguing about whose method was more efficient. Cowboys were finishing evening chores, their voices carrying across the yard in easy conversation. "Do you ever regret it?" Cole asked. "Not your father specifically, but losing your whole previous life? The church community, the familiar routines, everything you knew?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "No. What I lost was never really mine. It was all built on conditions: be perfect, be obedient, be small enough not to threaten anyone's comfort. That's not a life. It's a cage. And this is real. Hard sometimes, frustrating often, but real. Built on what I can actually do rather than who I'm supposed to be." She leaned against him, watching the sky turn orange and purple. "My father thought he was punishing me by sending me here. Instead, he accidentally gave me freedom. The freedom to discover what I was actually capable of when nobody was telling me I was shameful or sinful or wrong. You think he knows? That his punishment failed completely? I think he's convinced himself it succeeded. That I'm living in corruption and degradation, exactly as he predicted. He can't afford to see the truth that I'm happy, successful, raising children, contributing something meaningful. Admitting that would mean admitting he was wrong about everything. Margaret smiled slightly. But I stopped needing him to understand years ago. His approval or condemnation is equally irrelevant to my actual life. Cole kissed the top of her head. You've built something remarkable here. Not just the ranch systems, but yourself. The woman you've become. We built it, Margaret corrected. You gave me the chance. Treated me like I could be capable, instead of assuming I'd fail. That mattered more than you probably realize. I just gave you space. You did everything else. They sat in comfortable silence as stars began emerging, the ranch settling into night sounds around them. Somewhere in the distance a coyote called, answered by another. Cattle shifted in their pens. A dog barked once, then quieted. Margaret thought about the girl who had stood in this yard 15 years ago, terrified and ashamed, handed over as payment for services rendered. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, had required thousands of hours of work, countless failures, persistent determination to prove she could learn what she didn't know. But she had done it, had taken the punishment her father meant to destroy her and forged it into a life richer than anything she could have imagined in his narrow world. Her father had called her teaching Rose to read a sin. That act of mercy, that simple kindness, had led to everything that followed the exile, the arrival at Red River, the marriage, the children, the innovations that changed cattle ranching across the West. All because she had seen someone as worthy of help when others saw only degradation. The scar her father had meant to leave the mark of shame. The brand of sin had instead become proof of survival. Evidence that she could withstand judgment, could transform punishment into purpose, could build something worthwhile from the wreckage of condemnation. Sarah appeared at the door, holding a piece of paper covered in careful calculations. Mama, I finished the inventory projections you asked for. We'll need to reorder flour in 3 weeks if we maintain current consumption rates. Thank you, sweetheart. Put it on my desk. I'll review it in the morning. Sarah disappeared back inside. Cole chuckled. She's more like you every day. God help us when she's old enough to run her own ranch. She'll do it better than either of us, Margaret said with certainty. Won't be held back by anyone telling her she can't, or shouldn't, or isn't worthy. She'll just do it. Because you showed her it was possible. Because we're raising her to believe capability matters more than arbitrary judgments about what girls should or shouldn't. Margaret stood, stretching. Come on, let's go check those projections Sarah made. I want to see if she remembered to account for the new hands we're hiring next month. Cole followed her inside, into the warmth of lamplight and children's voices and a home built on work and respect and the revolutionary idea that showing mercy wasn't sin but strength. 15 years after being cast out as punishment, Margaret Pritchard Hayes stood as living proof that her father's judgment had been catastrophically wrong. Not just wrong about her, but wrong about what mattered, what defined worth, what actually constituted righteousness in a world that desperately needed more mercy and less condemnation. Her father had tried to erase her, to make her an example of the cost of defiance. Instead, she had become an example of something far more powerful, that people could survive rejection, could transform punishment into purpose, could build meaningful lives from the ruins of familial condemnation. The punishment was over. The legacy was just beginning. And Margaret Hayes, once the meme too sinful for her father's world, had built something that would outlast any sermon Silas Pritchard could ever preach. She had won. not through revenge or bitterness, but through the simple revolutionary act of living well, working hard, and proving that mercy mattered more than judgment. Her father's punishment had failed. Margaret's life had succeeded beyond measure. And that, ultimately, was the only verdict that mattered. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.